Hello and welcome once again to Beat the Reset. My name is Tim and I am the guy in the hat. Today I wanted to talk to you about confiscation, which is a topic that we hear with reference to precious metals, gold and silver. But it can also mean confiscation of just about anything and everything. I see a lot of social media channels that talk about all sorts of rumours and conjecture and hearsay surrounding confiscation, but what are the facts? What has happened previously? What is happening now? What is likely to happen in the future? In order to answer this question, we have to look historically, and I'm going to focus on the United States, and I want to take you back to the United States Constitution, which was ratified in 1789. The US Constitution, there is the Fifth Amendment, and under the Fifth Amendment, there is a small clause known as eminent domain, which translated means supreme power. In this case, the US government has the supreme power to effectively confiscate or take whatever it wants, whenever it wants, provided that two things are true. One is they have a need for the asset, and two is that they remunerate appropriately and effectively. But there are also other constitutions around the world that have the same kind of clause. For example, in the United Kingdom, there is expropriation, and in Australia, there is compulsory acquisition. Governments effectively have the constitutional right to take what they want as long as there is a reason to do so, as long as they remunerate effectively, and so on. Now, there are two types of confiscations which I think are worth talking about. One is called overt confiscation. Now, that is where it is in your face and it's really obvious it's being done because generally governments tell you that. The other one is covert, which is secret. In other words, you don't realize it's being done. And the covert confiscations happen more commonly than you would realize, far more commonly than an overt confiscation. After the ratification of the US Constitution in 1789, just 3 years later, the United States, under George Washington, of course, released its first Coinage Act in 1792, and it was several years before coins were minted by the US Mint. But even from the minting of the first coin in the United States, the first silver coin, which was about 25 grams or so, that coin was already debased by 1%. So there was already something called a covert confiscation going on. Back in 1792 and the 19th century, the common man was trading largely in silver. Gold wasn't really a trading mechanism. Gold was more a monetary reserve than a trading mechanism. Silver is always the trading mechanism of the people and has been since the dawn of time. I mean, we can say 6,000 years, but essentially since the dawn of mankind, silver has always been the trading mechanism of the people because it's very common, it has multiple usages, it has intrinsic value, and so on and so forth. Gold also has usages, not as many as silver, does also have intrinsic value, but the problem for gold is it's very rare, making it infinitely more expensive. In the 19th century and even the 18th century with the very first Coinage Act in 1792, gold and silver were measured against each other, not by a spot market, but by a ratio. And silver in 1792 was, in the Coinage Act, was 15 to 1 against gold, 15 pieces to 1 piece of gold, so 15 ounces to 1 ounce of gold. This left it open to the Treasury to alter the ratios and, of course, do something called a covert confiscation over time, which we saw in 1834. The first covert confiscation as silver disappeared offshore in the United States because in Europe, silver was more valuable than it was in the United States. So it made it far more obvious for people to trade it offshore. So people were sending silver to Europe. In an attempt to stop this happening, the US Congress debased silver from 15 to 1 to 16 to 1 against gold. And of course, it kept it on its shores instead of it all going offshore to Europe. So once again, this is called a covert confiscation. The common man wasn't really told about it so much. He just had to experience the loss of purchasing power, which is done time and time again. In 1848 to 1855, the United States had in California, a gold rush. It could be argued that it wasn't really a gold rush. It had far more to do with immigration and genocide than it ever had to do with gold. However, the United States was starting to pivot away from silver. And once again, this is a covert confiscation as the United States pivots into gold, looking at gold as a reserve system. Now, the reason is, of course, the Crown was putting enormous pressure on nations to trade on the gold standard. And in the 19th century, especially in the early to mid parts of the 19th century, the United States was on a bimetallic standard, which meant that silver and gold traded together virtually on equal footing, largely based on ratio trading. So by the time the gold rush came along in California, the silver was trading at 16 to 1 against gold. The United States was very, very quick to introduce some coinage acts that had increased the coinage from, or the gold content in the coinage. Once again, making silver all the poorer for it. By the time the American Civil War came along, the United States, that was 1861, the United States had largely run out of coinage. So in an attempt to keep the currency flowing, introduced paper known as greenbacks. This is another form of debasement. Now, the greenbacks were as good as gold or as good as silver, depending on what type of greenback you are actually issued. And you could take these back to any commercial bank and you could trade a piece of paper for the actual silver and gold that behind it. So this was a commodity-backed dollar. So that's not a bad thing. The only problem was that the banks apparently didn't have a lot of the time the gold and silver to convert. So largely the common man, once again, was left holding pieces of paper. In 1864, the United States Congress ratified the Coinage Act of 1864, which was largely a copper-based coinage. So now, of course, they've run out of coinage, silver and gold, largely issued paper to the common man, and now all of a sudden, in the Coinage Act of 1864, the common man's been given base metal coins of copper. So you can see this is largely more debasement. Earlier in 1857, the United States banned the Spanish silver dollar, leaving only the US silver dollar as a tradable mechanism on the mainland. And by the time we got to the end of the American Civil War, as I said, in 1865, a few things happened, very, very quick succession there. First of all, the common man had moved from a commodity trading mechanism of silver to pieces of paper known as greenbacks, largely had access to base metal coins known as, they were copper coins. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, and by 1873, the United States had moved virtually completely onto what we call a quasi-gold standard. So the whole world was shifting to this gold trading mechanism. Now, the problem for the common man is he didn't trade in gold. The problem for the common man is he traded in silver. And in 1873, the Coinage Act of 1873 quickly became known as the crime of 1873. And again, this was not an overt confiscation, it was a covert confiscation. In other words, the Coinage Act largely prevented bullion, silver bullion, from being brought into the mints as it had been done for the last 100 years to be minted into coinage. So this was highly problematic for the common man. In fact, it caused so many problems that there was, of course, a massive gold and silver movement. There were purchase acts that were put into place to try to purchase silver from the Comstock lode, which had been discovered in the United States. It was a silver mine. There were all sorts of attempts to kind of restabilize silver. There was the minting of the Morgan silver dollar through that period. And there was the Great Panic of 1893, which effectively was a depression. We saw the assassination of James Garfield in 1881. We saw, as the US moved on to the gold standard in 1900, we saw the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. And you can see how these huge covert/overt confiscations caused the deaths of US presidents and the destruction of the common man. People were largely decimated. Farming communities were destroyed as a result of the Coinage Act of 1873. Just 27 years later or so, in 1900, there was, of course, the US Congress signed into life the Gold Standard Act of 1900. Now, gold was at $20.67 back then. By 1907, there was another depression, what they call Great Panic. The world went into, or the United States went into depression for around about 4 weeks. That's it. That's all it was. It was only about a month or so, but there was huge panic, huge unrest, huge loss on the markets and so on. Again, more covert confiscations. I won't talk about the rise of the Federal Reserve in 1913. I won't talk about the First World War. I will mention, of course, there was a stock market crash in 1921, just after Wall Street was blown up on September 16, 1920. There's all sorts of, again, these are known as covert confiscations, the collapse of derivative markets. Then by 1929, of course, 8,000 banks collapsed between 1929 and 1932. That was under the watch of Herbert Hoover. And then, of course, when Franklin Roosevelt came to power on March the 4th, 1933, then began what we call the overt confiscations. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was largely, it was hoped that he would be a president of the people. But not only was he the longest serving president in US history, he served 3 terms, the only president ever to serve 3 terms, of course, because the amendment, the 25th Amendment that handles US presidents was changed in 1952. So he was able to reign for 3 terms. That's right, from 1933 all the way up to April 12th, 1945, upon his death at towards the end of the Second World War. We have an overt confiscation for the first time where the government, under Executive Order 6102, signed off by Franklin Roosevelt on April the 5th, gave people 25 days to bring back their gold to the banks or be charged with trading secrets of the Enemy Act of 1917, which was terrorism. So this is an overt confiscation. This is the only time in US history this has been done. There are very few references to these kinds of confiscations being done throughout world history. As I said, most of the confiscations are covert. In other words, you don't know they're being done. But here we have it, 1933, April 5th. The common man's given 25 days to admit that he has gold, first of all. And if you did that, I think that would have been silly. I think it would be better just to have laid low and pretended that you didn't have any gold and then just leave it at that. The government was definitely not going to come knocking on your door because that was far too difficult. So yes, gold was confiscated in 1933. And of course, that was all done under Emergency Banking Acts. This basically came under the banner of something called the New Deal. We would call it the New World Order or something like that these days, or Agenda 2030, whatever you want to call it. But in 1933, it was known as the New Deal, and gold was confiscated. Gold bullion and gold coin. Numismatics and collectibles and fine art could not be confiscated because the US government could not pay the price that came with those kind of rare collectibles. However, they could pay the price for bullion and they could pay the price for standard gold coinage because it was $20.67 an ounce, and that is all you got. Now, of course, many people were desperate in 1933 because Roosevelt had closed the banks down on March the 6th. So people were largely desperate and starving, those that are in the urban areas. So they were very, very eager to bring back their coinage to the commercial banks and hand it in. They were very, very eager to bring their bullion back to get anything they could for them. In 1933, a further 2,000 banks collapsed. So 10,000 commercial banks had collapsed between 1929 and 1933. By 1934, the United States did a couple of interesting things under Franklin Roosevelt. They introduced the Gold Reserve Act of 1934 on January the 30th, and the US president then, Franklin Roosevelt, debased the US dollar by 59% by raising the price of gold from $20.67 to $35 an ounce. Now that debased the US dollar by 59%, which meant that the common man had lost a huge amount of his buying power, having had his gold confiscated just a year earlier. And then, of course, in the August of 1934, there was a silver confiscation. Now, isn't that interesting? We weren't expecting that. So silver bullion was confiscated in the August of 1934 under what they call the Silver Purchase Act. So they don't even call it, the US government didn't call it a confiscation, they called it a silver purchase. So the Silver Purchase Act of 1934 meant that bullion was being bought by the Treasury. However, coinage was spared. So if you had silver coinage, that was left in circulation right up until 1968. However, there were attempts, example in the Coinage Act of 1965, to debase the silver within the coinage. And of course, by 68, it was all over. There was a US president that attempted, of course, using silver certificates to take the power of currency printing off the Federal Reserve in 1963. It was under Executive Order 11110. President John F. Kennedy tried to move the powers of the monetary system clearly from the hands of the Federal Reserve over to the Treasury, issuing certificates that were convertible to silver. Of course, that may, I think, if we have a look at what happened to John F. Kennedy, I think somebody sent him a very clear message. It's probably not a smart move, especially considering that there was a monetary accord between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, which had resurrected the powers of the Federal Reserve in 1951, known as the Accord, the 1951 Accord. There are also the obvious debasements that we see throughout the late 1960s, early 1970s, especially under President Nixon. When President Nixon took the United States off the gold standard and removed the United States from the Bretton Woods system, shortly after he did that, now he did that on August the 15th, 1971, but by the December, he had debased the US dollar. In fact, he raised the price of gold. So raising the price of gold against the dollar debases the dollar. And he did that. He raised the price of gold from $35 an ounce to $38 an ounce in the December of 1971. This is again another covert confiscation. And then again, in 1973, in the October, President Nixon raised the price of gold to $42.22 statutorily, again debasing the US dollar, which of course meant that Kissinger could come along and broker a little deal with the Saudis to create something called the petrodollar. So throughout history, we have seen these confiscations, and the question is, are we likely to see the confiscation of precious metals again going into the future, into this digital future? And I've spoken about this many times, and I don't see that. I can't actually see how a government is going to confiscate a commodity which largely the common man doesn't own anymore. It's not 1933. In 1933, the common man largely used something called specie, which was commodity-based coinage, silver and gold coinage. However, in 2023, which is where we are right now, that we don't have a commodity-based coinage. We have a fiat currency, which is largely a useless derivative. Well, it's not even a derivative anymore. It's just an empty piece of junk, garbage. So essentially, we don't have anything like that anymore. And most people, if you have a look at the acumen and the intelligence level and the maturity as far as commodities goes, most people, especially urban middle class, has no concept of commodities whatsoever. So it doesn't make any sense to me why you would go after 1% or less than 1% of the population for the purposes of issuing eminent domain or confiscating precious metals, where I believe that digital currencies, private currencies such as cryptocurrencies, far more people would understand those, and far more people in the middle class would have those, and it'd make far more sense to go after cryptocurrencies, as would be evidenced by Executive Order 14067, signed into life by Joe Biden on March 9, 2022, which was for the full regulation and suppression of the digital space as the government, together with its central banks, pivots into position in readiness for its new central bank digital currencies. So that's how I see it. So as you can see throughout history, most of the confiscations that we talk about are not actually overt. There's only been one really overt confiscation. In Australia, in my own country, and there is no confiscation. There have been zero confiscations. There is reference to confiscations in the Banking Act of 1959, Section 4. They were watered down in 1976. However, there's never been a confiscation in Australia. So in the United States, the only one was 1933, April 5th to May 1st, 1933. The rest were all covert confiscations. So I hope you learned something today. From me, the guy in the hat, wishing you all the best. Remember, make good choices.